Good evening, everyone. I hope you're doing well. And tonight's lecture is going to be on resource economics, and it's going to be kind of locally based. And this is actually one of my favorite lectures to give. I have fun with this one. I don't know if you will have any fun whatsoever with it, but we can certainly try. Before I dive in, though, I want to remind you that a week from tonight is our second midterm. So there's tonight's lecture, there's one more lecture next Tuesday, and then a week from tonight, next week on Thursday, will be our second midterm. So on Tuesday, when I upload the lecture, I will also be uploading a study guide so that you have that time to review for the lecture. Or excuse me, for the exam. If you have any questions, please go ahead and reach out. Otherwise, be aware that the midterm exam is coming up, and I will have more information for you on that next week. So, with that, let's go ahead and get into resource economics. And I can start by asking if any of you know where this is. For those of you who may have seen this, this is up in the Monterey Bay and Pacific Grove region of California. So if you've been there, you probably recognize it. If you haven't been there, I would strongly encourage you to go. It is a spectacular area. It's beautiful to visit, and it is key to what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of resources. So to get started on resource economics, let's go back to our earlier definition of what resources are. Anything with potential for use in creating wealth or providing satisfaction. That's the definition we had earlier, at least in terms of how humans use resources, and we'll be following along with that tonight and then building off that idea. Now, in terms of resources that humans use in that manner, there's a couple of two basic divisions. And one of them you can see here. You see the deer there. This is, we left Monterey and we've gone back to Yosemite National Park. But you see all the trees, and the trees are capable of reproducing. They're capable of growing and releasing seeds that can grow into new trees. You've got bushes and grass in the foreground, same thing. You've got deer in the foreground that are capable of reproducing, and you've got water that comes back to this valley every year as meltwater from the surrounding snowpack in the Sierras. So all of these are resources that are able to be replenished. And so these are known as renewable resources. And all other things being equal, that's an important caveat, but all other things being equal, you can expect them to continue to be replenished year after year, and you can count on them. And it's not just renewable resources like organisms. As we've discussed, it is the biological processes that they also provide. It is the interactions between different kinds of organisms. You can have bees pollinating plants. You can have deer eating grass and then depositing pollen and seeds in what they defecate, and so on. You have renewable resources both in terms of the organisms themselves and in terms of the processes that they bring to the table. And just for fun, this is a picture from my front yard of a couple of different pollinators, a hummingbird on the left and a honeybee on the right. And you can hopefully see the big swollen bags of pollen on the honeybee over there on the right. Both of them providing a service, both of them pollinating and helping this plant to reproduce. And so this is probably going on all around you, and it's a biological process that we depend on. Now, there are different kinds of resources that are present in abundance, but that are present in finite amounts and that don't replenish. They don't make more of themselves. They don't reproduce. We aren't going to get any more. And resources like that can include things like minerals, rocks and minerals, and also things like petroleum or natural gas and so on, which are present on the planet, again, in large reservoirs, but they are finite reservoirs. There are finite amounts of these resources available on the planet. So these are known as non-renewable resources. It is true, as we will talk about in a future lecture, that oil is derived from living things. And so if organisms continue to live and be deposited and so on, they can eventually form oil, but it takes millions of years. So in terms of our use of oil as a resource, it's not replenishing itself fast enough to keep up with the pace of consumption. And so as a consequence, it's considered a non-renewable resource. And that emphasizes an important point. If you take a renewable resource and you use it faster than it can be replenished, then it becomes a non-renewable resource. Suddenly if you have a forest with lots of trees, lots of bushes, and so on, technically that is renewable. But then if you cut down all of the trees in that forest and leave none behind to reproduce, then they're not going to reproduce. They're not going to come back. And what you're left with is a lot of nothing. That's one of the reasons the Forest Service and the National Park Service and so on were created, to marshal and conserve those resources so that they aren't eliminated. It's because the use can determine whether or not something is renewable or non-renewable. We are in October right now. We're eventually moving towards the holidays. For those of you who like to buy holiday trees or Christmas trees, you might notice that if you're buying live trees or trees from a tree farm, you show up and they will sell you trees from a specific lot. Once upon a time, many years ago, my wife and I went out to buy a tree. We went to a local tree lot and we got out of the car, and there were just these beautiful trees. And it was late in the season, so I was surprised and I was very excited because they had some gorgeous trees. And I pointed out to the guy and said, I'd like that one. And he said, those are next year's trees. Over here are this year's trees, and they were all small and runty and misshapen because we got there so late in the season. And they weren't going to cut into the next season's trees, because if they kept doing that, then next season they won't have enough trees, because they were making sure that they would have a renewable bank of trees every year for sale every time around the holidays. It's making sure that you aren't exceeding the replenishment rate of those resources. And so you can take a renewable resource and make it non-renewable if you harvest it faster than it can be replenished. And that leads us to a discussion of sea otters, who we have been talking about off and on all semester. But now let's take a look at some sea otters, who are pretty darn adorable, I think. Anyway, this is the Monterey Bay area, and this is off the coast of California. And these are national marine sanctuaries off the coast of Central California. And this is where sea otters and other organisms have been known to hang out in the kelp forests. Now, characteristic of this area, you have some of these wonderful, cool, moisture-bearing air currents that come down the coast and follow along the coast. And they are paralleled by an ocean current, a cooling ocean current known as the California Current, that is carrying cool waters down the coast of California. For those of you who may have done any snorkeling or any diving, if you've gone diving, let's say in Hawaii versus diving off the coast of California, you know that California can be extremely chilly compared to other diving places like the Hawaiian Islands. And it's because of that California current. It's because of the coolness of the California current. For those of you who have taken the opportunity to drive up the California coast, it can be absolutely spectacular, but also you can many times see something like this, where you have bright sunlight if you're a little bit inland, but then along the coast you have those cool air temperatures, you have that cool California current, and it's maintaining those low banks of fogs and enabling trees like these wonderful cypress trees to grow into all these fantastic shapes. And again, this is just a drive. If you have the time when you're not studying, maybe when winter break is coming up, maybe take a break and drive along the California coast and realize what you have available to you in your backyard. Even without spending much money at all, it can be truly spectacular. And it's where otters hang out. Now, I am terrible at taking pictures of otters. I do have a few that I'm going to share here, and I'm going to keep going back and trying to get more, because I'm always thinking of you. I'm always looking to take pictures of otters, not for me, but for you. I'm thinking of you. Anyway, otters living along here, and they are a part of California's kelp forest ecosystem. It is a forest that is under the water, dominated by kelp. And you can see sea otters over there. They are meat-eating animals, and they eat things like sea stars and sea mussels and sea urchins and abalone and other, things of that nature. They are meat-eating animals. And so if I were to ask you on the exam, Where in this trophic hierarchy would you put sea otters? I just gave it to you. They are not plant-eating animals, so they are not primary consumers, which means they are at least secondary consumers. They are eating a lot of other organisms that do eat plants. They might even make it up into tertiary consumers, but generally there are higher level consumers that are preying on the sea otters. So if I ask you, they are not primary consumers, they are at least secondary consumers. And as a consequence of their position in that trophic hierarchy, they have been very helpful in maintaining the health of biological communities in the California kelp forests. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We are not the only peoples in California who have considered them to be a resource. In fact, if you go back several hundreds and thousands of years, there were people living in the Monterey Bay and Pacific Grove region, what those regions are today, known as the Ohlone. And they go back potentially as far back as about 4000 BC, so over 5,000 years ago. And the descendants of these people are still with us today. And they successfully survived and thrived in this area by depending on things like sea otters. We're going to talk about why in a moment, but they harvested sea otters, they harvested fish, they harvested grasses, they harvested acorns, they used fire to control the growth of grasses under the trees so that they could promote acorn growth. Um, Basically, very effectively working in this area for literally thousands of years. I want to emphasize that because we have talked earlier about larger civilizations like the Greeks and the Romans and so on, and we've talked about civilizations that come and civilizations that go. And the reason that civilizations develop, as we've discussed, is at least biologically because it's an artificial attempt to maintain carrying capacity. And when that ability falls apart, your civilization falls apart as well. Here, they're not trying to artificially maintain carrying capacity. They're working within the natural carrying capacity. They aren't just living in it. As I say, they are modifying their environment, but they're working within the constraints of their given biological community. They're taking advantage of the way the plants and animals interact. They're harvesting the animals they need. They're harvesting sea otters for their pelts. We'll talk about that in a moment. They're harvesting mussels, they're harvesting fish, and they're also harvesting and organizing and promoting plants. But it's kind of streamlining things to make it more efficient. It's not artificially enhancing it or replacing it. And this has been something that's documented as of 2022, again, based on genomics as well as archaeology, to be a pattern that goes back literally thousands of years. So when you think about some of the civilizations that we've talked about in Rome, in Sumer, in Egypt, and so forth, the Ohlone peoples have outlasted all of them. They have been a relatively stable population, at least up until historic times when the Spanish and other European explorers arrived. But prior to that, they were a very successful local group of people, and I'm using them as an example. Number one, because they were in the Monterey Bay, Pacific Grove area, as we know it today. But also because this study was conducted on the people, on their genomes, and on their archaeological record. But what we see here with the Ohlone is very likely true for any number of other California indigenous peoples. More locally, you've got the Tongva, you've got the Serrano, you move inland, you've got the Paiute, and so on. And in all these cases, you had people who were working within the constraints of their environment at or around carrying capacity, modifying things, yes. And as we talked about last time, trading with other indigenous groups. But still, it's a relatively stable way of life that goes back literally thousands of years. And as I just mentioned, this changed with the arrival of the Spanish and other European explorers who came in for a variety of reasons. One, the Spanish were a global power. They're looking to extend their global power and their global range. They're looking for riches. They're looking for ways to support their expansion, and they're also looking for labor, particularly slave labor. And unfortunately for the indigenous people, That's what they ended up doing, is being forced to work in the missions to help the missions raise various crops and various animals. And I emphasize this because now you're seeing a change, and we talked about this previously. It's no longer a group of people who were used to a given biological community, a given biome, and working within that and building on that. Now it is people coming in from a completely different region with a completely different group of crops and a completely different group of domesticated animals and imposing them on the region. And as a consequence, you get a different result. And so the indigenous people here were now removed from their way of doing things and inserted into this new, more European way of raising things, raising cattle, raising horses, and so forth. To the point where I want you to remember an earlier lecture we were talking about. You remember I talked about blaming England for bringing the cattle to Hawaii, where we had Captain George Vancouver giving cattle to King Kamehameha, and it's the start of the cattle farms in on the Hawaiian Islands. And I told you that this happened a couple of times. What I don't think I mentioned is that the cattle that Vancouver acquired he got in California before he headed over the ocean to get to the Hawaiian Islands. And he got them from the Monterey and Pacific Grove regions. So the missionaries who were enslaving the indigenous people and requiring them to raise these animals and these plants were now supplying, excuse me, supplying the cattle that then went to the Hawaiian Islands so that people can have grass-fed beef burgers on the Hawaiian Islands today. But the point to emphasize here is this is now an imposition of a perceived order, a perceived way of doing things on an existing community, an existing ecosystem. And there is, and I'm not trying to be whatever here, this is strictly biologically a reality that there is an assumption of superior knowledge, superior practices, that we know better how to turn this land into being productive. We have the techniques, we have the abilities, we have the knowledge. All we need is a labor force, preferably one we don't have to pay, and land. And so as the Spanish arrive in California, that's what they start doing, is taking over the peoples and taking over the land to now produce meat and milk and plants the way they think is best, irrespective of what might actually be happening in California biologically at the time they arrive. And it's not just for sustenance either, because as I mentioned, Spain is a global power. So they're looking to expand their global power, their global influence, and they're also looking to participate in global commerce, where the goods and services that they produce in California or that they have the indigenous people produce for them are then spread across or spread out to the rest of the globe, and it enables their economic power as well as their military power. And part of what they were doing, part of what they were harvesting, was sea otters. Sea otters became a very valuable commodity to them. And you might not think about that then today, but that's because we had technology today to provide for us now some of the things that sea otters were providing back then. So I want you to think about yourself. I want you to think about your hair and how much hair you have, how much thick, rich hair you have on your head. It's going to vary from person to person. It's a very good thing I'm teaching virtually because my hair is getting thinner practically by the day. In fact, my wife even commented earlier today on my hair getting thin and was wondering if maybe I needed to take supplements or something. Anyway, the point being, for those of you who have, let's say, an average amount of hair on your head, on the average, you probably have about 200 or 2,000 and 2,200 or 2,200 hairs per square inch on your head. It's a lot of hair. Think about a square inch and think about having over 2,000 hairs just in that relatively small area. Sea otters, on the other hand, have over 600,000 hairs per square inch. In many cases, up to over 1 million hairs per square inch, which means they have enormously concentrated fur. And they do that as an adaptation to cold water. We've already mentioned the California current and how chilly it can be. This is how sea otters adapt to those cold conditions. Other organisms like whales, like elephant seals, and so on, they do it by having lots of blubber, and the blubber insulates them and keeps them warm. In the case of sea otters, they've had a different evolutionary trajectory, and as a consequence, instead of focusing on blubber, they have focused on dense fur. So I will probably test you on something along these lines. How many hairs per square inch do otters have? It'll probably be a multiple choice question, so you might want to lock in on that and think about that. And so back in those days, before we had, the jackets and so on that keep us warm today, you could sell that fur, and it would be great for fur coats. It would be great in cold areas for keeping people warm. And so as a consequence, sea otters became a commodity and a valuable one. And so this is a page from the National Park Service talking about how in the 1740s people were coming to California and killing sea otters and obtaining their fur. Before the year 1740, there were estimated to be about 300,000 sea otters in the world, but by the year 1900, there were only about 2,000. That's a precipitous drop off. And they disappeared from the Monterey Bay region altogether. They were completely extirpated from that area. So they left the ecosystem. And you can see this. This is a graph of sea otter skins exported from Russia, where they were also being collected. And you can see again, starting in 1740, they start being harvested. And then after about 1780, the harvesting skyrockets. It really takes off. And at that same time, here in California, you can see in the 1780s, you see that same spike. And then you see it dropping off. And it's dropping off not because people weren't interested in furs, it's because the sea otters were becoming increasingly rare and increasingly rare and increasingly rare, to the point where by the 1840s, sea otters were so rare that a single otter pelt would cost almost as much as a new house. Literally, that is not an exaggeration. And so this is why the market bottomed out, because there weren't enough sea otters to support the market for sea otter furs. They had been harvested so intensively that they were almost eliminated. And in the Monterey Bay area, the Pacific Grove area, they were regionally eliminated or extirpated. And you can see this is the California mission period here. And so again, you can see that it was during this period that the missions with their enslaved peoples were harvesting these otters and selling them on the global market, as well as using them themselves. Now, here's the thing. As we mentioned at the beginning, as part of this biological discussion, you have sea otters as part of the kelp forest ecosystem. And as I already mentioned, and as I may test you on, they are secondary consumers, which means they are eating animals that are eating plants. And in this case, one of the animals that they like to eat are sea urchins. And they've actually been documented. This is a picture. This is not my picture. I found it online, but this is a sea otter eating a sea urchin. And so, what do you think would happen if the sea otters were eliminated from the ecosystem? What's going to happen to the sea urchins in the Monterey Bay area, in the Pacific Grove area, if you take sea otters out of the picture? Suddenly, nothing is eating the sea urchins, and suddenly they're doing great. And what do sea urchins eat? They eat kelp. They are plant eaters. They are primary consumers. I may test you on that. So, what happens if you have a plant eater that's eating the plants and there's nothing keeping it in check? There's nothing eating it. There's nothing controlling its population numbers. What happens is your kelp disappears. And suddenly you've got nothing but urchins. And this is referred to as an urchin barren, where the kelp has been eliminated and you've got nothing but urchins. Now, what happens next is that your urchins start to collapse. Their population numbers go down because they have nothing to eat. And as their population numbers dwindle, the kelp starts to come back. And as the kelp starts to come back, your sea urchins start to come back and they eat all the kelp and so on. And we've talked about that pattern through time. That is an eruptive growth pattern where they overshoot the resource base. In this case, they overconsume the kelp. The kelp turns from being a renewable resource to being a non-renewable resource because it is being consumed faster than it can be harvested. And the reason that's happening is because otters were turned from a renewable resource to a non-renewable resource because in this area they were harvested faster than they could be replenished. It's the same thing. It's the same pattern. It's eruptive growth. Overshooting carrying capacity, and then a population dieback, and then a slow recovery, and then another overshoot, another dieback, and on and on and on, which is not a stable community. It is not a healthy community. And so this is what happened when the sea otters were eliminated from local ecosystems. Now, there are other organisms that sea otters also ate in the California kelp forest system. For those of you who recognize this, this is an abalone. I will ask you the same question. What would happen to abalones if their predators, that would be sea otters, suddenly disappear and they're suddenly not preying on them? What's going to happen is your abalones are going to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And not only that, but they're going to get big. They're going to get much larger than if sea otters were there. Now, I don't know how many of you may have eaten abalone. It's pretty tasty. And so what happens if off the coast of California, people notice that suddenly all of the abalones are huge, big, gorgeous, tasty looking abalones, and they're growing that large and that numerous because the sea otters have been eliminated. Well, what happens, and this is actually a sea otter eating one of those mussels to demonstrate, yes, they do that as well. What happened is humans followed in the wake of the sea otters, and now humans started consuming all those big, fat, juicy abalones for a short period of time because the humans were over consuming the resource. They saw a hugely widely available resource ready for their use, and they immediately started consuming it and over-consumed it. So within less than 2 decades, they had pretty much farmed all of the abalone out because they were over-consuming it. They were consuming it faster than it could be replenished, which means it became a non-renewable resource. The same as the kelp did with the urchins, and the same as the sea otters did with the fur trappers. I hope you're seeing a pattern here. The whole point of this lecture is to emphasize this pattern. As you probably know, there are also gray whales off the coast of California, and they are also known to have come into Monterey Bay. And so in Monterey Bay, there were people from Europe, from Spain, and so on who would hunt them using boats, but there were also the indigenous people themselves who would take advantage of whales when they washed ashore. And then with the arrival of the Spanish, they started more strongly concentrating on harvesting whales in the region. Now, I mentioned we already have gray whales. They're still with us today. So they weren't driven extinct. They weren't eliminated, but they were regionally extirpated. So if you look at gray whale numbers, you can see from the 1850s up to the 1890s, you have a certain number of gray whales being documented, and then the numbers plummet, not because they've been eliminated, but because they're no longer coming into the Monterey Bay Pacific Grove region. They're staying much further out to sea so that they aren't as easily preyed upon, and as a consequence, their numbers dwindle closer into shore. So it's another resource that was overutilized, and the only reason it survived is that it was able to move away from the shores and get some distance between itself and humans. It's between the years 1850 and 1900. Next in the step is sardines. And so I hope you see that what's happening is you have one resource that is overharvested, and that leads to biological consequences. And then another resource is overharvested, and that leads to different biological consequences. And then another resource is overharvested, and that leads to biological consequences. And it's kind of this treadmill, one thing to another, one thing to another, moving from one resource to the next, to the next. And as you eliminate one resource, you find another one that hopefully takes its place. And so in this case, the next resource that people started taking advantage of was sardines. Sardines are quite edible. And this is something for those of you who look at this and go, ew, I'm totally with you. I spent almost my whole life not wanting to eat sardines, not liking to open tins and see a bunch of dead fish and just nothing to do with them. And once upon a time, my wife and I were on a hike, and sardines are all that she'd brought. So I decided to suffer through it. And it's like, Oh my gosh, these are really good. These are tasty. They're oily and salty and yummy. So now I love sardines, and I'm not alone. Lots and lots of people eat sardines all the time, depending on the brand. Um, and as a consequence, collecting sardines in places like Monterey and Pacific Grove is big business. And it became a big business in that area for many, many years because it was the next resource. And when you see these giant schools of fish out there off the coast, it looks like you will never, ever, ever run out of them. And that leads us to a discussion of economics. And so I want to talk briefly. We're going to move away from pictures of otters and pictures of dead fish, and we're going to start talking about economics because economics is actually very complicated and in many cases over my head. For those of you who study economics, my hat is off to you. You are smarter people than I will ever be. I'm not going to get deep into economic theory tonight. I am going to touch on some of the very most basic stuff to the point where if you take something made of matter and you add energy to it as part of an economic transaction, you can produce a product and you generate some waste. You're always going to generate waste because if you were transforming matter and transforming energy, no energy transformation is 100% efficient. Some is always going to be lost as heat, as waste. But there's also waste involved in changing matter from one thing to another. You know this every time you eat, every time you do something, you're probably generating some form of waste. So you get a product and you get waste. Now, instead of a car, let's look at sardines. And so that's the matter. All you have to do is expend the energy to harvest it, to clean it up, to put it in little tins, to seal the tins, pack them with oil, and so on, and generate a product that then you can sell, right? There is going to be some waste. You're going to get rid of the guts of the fish. In many cases, you're going to cut the heads of the fish off. You're going to trim some of the tin or aluminum that you're using for the dishes. You're going to have some oil that you're not able to use. You're going to have all sorts of waste that is generated as a byproduct of transforming that matter, those fish, into a product that people are willing to buy and eat. Right? Now, let's imagine that you spend $1 worth of matter and $1 worth of energy to produce your product. Right? So over there on the right, that product costs you $2 to make. You want to sell it, but you want to sell it at a profit. You're not doing this for fun, right? You're doing this to make a profit. This is economics. So let's say you charge $5, right? $2 of matter and energy in, $5, and that leaves you with $3 profit. And that's a pretty good deal. You spent $2 and you get $3. And you keep doing that for a while with something as abundant as sardines, then you end up making a profit. But there's still that pesky waste down there at the bottom. You're still generating waste that you are expecting other people to deal with. That's the waste there. Waste is externalized costs. Waste is stuff that is not paid for as part of the transaction. When I spend my $5 and I buy that tin of sardines, there are fish guts floating in the ocean. There are fish heads resting on the bottom of the ocean. There are little snippets of tin or steel on the floor. There are people who are working to produce this who slip and injure themselves and so on, and that's not being paid for necessarily as part of the transaction. That's external to this, depending on how this is set up. So imagine instead what I could consider to be a more environmentally friendly approach, a more human health friendly approach, where instead of $5, you charge $10. And you take $5 of that and you use that to reduce waste. You're still making your $3, right? You're still making exactly the same profit. Your customers are paying more, but what they are doing is paying for all of the transaction. They're paying for more of the waste that is generated. They're paying for dealing with that waste. It's putting the cost where it belongs with the consumer who is actually causing this waste to be produced. And so this is known as internalizing costs. And generally speaking, an environmentally respectful approach is to reduce waste. It's to internalize those costs. This is why, for those of you who try to buy organic food, um, in many cases, organic forms, not all, there's all sorts of variation there because it's organic is kind of a loose term. And I don't want to get into that discussion, but generally speaking, organic produce is a little more expensive, and it's because more of that money is going into reducing the waste that is being generated by more, let's say, industrial processes. I hope that makes sense. Okay. Moving away from the bay, moving into other things, you have seen this in your life and you're still going to continue to see it. That difference between internalizing costs versus externalizing costs. And the example I will give you is the Camp Fire from back in 2018, which you may have heard of. There were 85 people who lost their lives. There were about 19,000 buildings destroyed. And the total cost of this catastrophe was $16.65 billion dollars. That is an enormous expense. This is what the fire looked like from space. You can see it's covering an enormous part of California. And a number of people, as I mentioned, lost their homes, lost their lives. And the reason was because of high winds and poorly maintained electrical lines. This is actually thought to be the culprit. This is a bracket for holding an electrical power line. When you see those power towers going through Cajon Pass or elsewhere along the highways, this is one of the hooks, one of the brackets that holds that in place. And in a wind event, it snapped and the live cable fell to the ground in some dry brush and it ignited the fire. And suddenly there are dozens of people dead, there are hundreds, thousands of homes lost, there are billions of dollars in damage. Just as a consequence of this hook looking like this. This is the one that is thought to have been guilty. This is not from Southern California Edison where we are. This is PG&E. But still, their responsibility was to maintain the integrity of their power transmission system, and it's expensive. And so they saved costs by not maintaining things like this hook. This is a different hook that, had it been left, probably the same thing would have happened. You can see that deep divot in the hook. That's where the power line was wearing through the metal. It had been up so long, and that power line had been dragging on it for so long that it was about exhausted. And a few more years of this, and this one would have broken, and that power line would have dropped. And if it dropped into some dry brush in a high wind event, you might have had another catastrophic fire. And so, had this hook been maintained, had the other hook been maintained, had you been sending people out on a regular basis, updating them, your electrical bills would have been more expensive. Every PG&E customer would have been paying more and probably would have been complaining about it. And all those people might still be alive and all those homes might still be there, and that $16.65 billion would not have to have been expended because it was externalizing a cost in order to save on how much customers are being charged. I hope that makes sense. Externalizing costs is causing waste, and sometimes that waste can really come back to bite you. What PG&E and SC are doing, I'm getting a little off the subject, but again, I want to show you this. If you have overhead lines, they are relatively easy to construct. They are relatively easy to maintain. So it costs about $500,000 per mile to develop these. But because of high wind events, you can have the potential for tragedy if you're not keeping up on your maintenance, if you're not making sure everything is up to date, everything is maintained. Now, a way to solve that is to put everything underground so that high wind events are not going to affect it. The challenge there is that underground cables cost $5 million per mile, 10 times as much. And so it's much more expensive. It's also much more time consuming. It takes, I don't know how long it takes. I'm not an expert in this, but I imagine you can drive into an area, put up a telephone pole, put up some power lines, connect them to another one, and do that in a matter of a few days. To put in an underground line, you've got to block off the street, you've got to prevent traffic, you've got to pick up the asphalt, you've got to dig the trenches, you've got to put the cable down, you've got to make sure everything's in there, and then you've got to rebury everything. It's going to take a prolonged period of time. It's going to take a lot more person hours and person effort to get it done. And so, as a consequence, it is a lot more expensive and a lot more time consuming. I'm not trying to promote or justify anything here. I'm simply saying it's easier and faster and less expensive to do things above ground. It is safer, but more intensive to do them below ground. And so in the past, you have had buildings or structures above ground, and that's what led to that fire. Both the structures being above ground and having the cable, the clamps for the power lines not being inspected, not being maintained, and eventually collapsing because of those externalized costs. Now, both SCE and PG&E are aware of this, and because PG&E was found legally liable for the Camp Fire, now for insurance reasons, if the wind gets beyond a certain point, they turn off power. This is from January of this year throughout Southern California, and all of those little bell shaped icons are safety power shutoffs, where the power was turned off because there were high wind events, and in order to avoid a fire, they shut the power down. Now, this is also externalizing costs because who is going to pay for losing power? Who is going to pay for the food in your refrigerator that starts to go over? Who's going to pay for not having that available? And we had massive fires in Pacific Palisades. And what happened there is that with the power off, there wasn't enough power to pump water to fight the fires. So it was a catastrophe of a different nature that is still being studied and attempted to be understood. But this is a consequence where now you, as a consumer, somebody getting this power, are suddenly told there's no power for you. There's no power during the winter for your heaters. There's no power during the summer for your air conditioning. There's no power for your refrigerator. There's no power for your lights. There's no power for you to log onto your computer and use your Wi Fi and attend this class. All of those are impacts that are externalized to you rather than being paid for by electrical customers in advance. And it's because of the impact of these fires and because of the insurance and because of the lawsuits. Those are all externalities. Does that make sense? The external costs are what's driving the boat on this, and they're really coming back to haunt us in multiple ways. And that's consistent with cutting corners, doing things a little quicker, a little less effectively, and generating more waste. What does this have to do with sardines? Well, the sardine fisheries in the Monterey Bay Pacific Grove area were enormously successful and made a lot of money. You can read about them in the John Steinbeck book Cannery Row if you're interested. It is a lighthearted book. It's very interesting. If you have the time, I'd encourage you to read it. But it takes place on Cannery Row in the Monterey area, and it's all about the sardine fisheries that were producing and harvesting sardines in this area. And this went on year after year after year after year, and the communities boomed and they thrived because the sardines were so numerous that it seemed like they would never be exhausted. And so, any number of people being employed and the product being shipped all over the world. Literally, people eating sardines from this area all over the world. Now, there was a biologist at the time named Ed Ricketts who lived in the Pacific Grove region, and he was studying the patterns of the sardines and the sardine harvest. And he realized that even though it looked like you had an unlimited number of sardines and it looked like that was going to be a never ending renewable resource, it wasn't. And at the rate that things were being harvested, eventually the resource was going to dwindle and no longer be viable. Now, people actually did listen to him. Politicians in the area listened to him and tried to impose constraints on the harvest, saying don't harvest more than a certain amount per season. But most of the people who were involved ignored them because their livelihoods depend on it. And most of the politicians who were being supported by the monies from those people, they passed the guidelines, but they didn't actually work too hard to enforce them because that's where their money was coming from. So the system didn't quite work. And as you can probably imagine, that renewable resource was turned into a non renewable resource. There was one hitch there because World War II happened. We have talked about World War II multiple times already. We're talking about it again because as America moves across the world fighting World War II, as other armies from other areas, the Allied powers, move across the world, they need to carry their food with them. And an awesome food source would be sardines because they pack up easy, they preserve for a long time, they don't take up a lot of space, they're very tasty, they've got a lot of protein, they're just excellent for this sort of thing. And so when World War II broke out, you had these sardines being produced in the Monterey Bay area. And you can see here that there was a period of time where things really took off in 1929, and then the Great Depression hits, so the consumption drops off. And then about the middle 1930s, the numbers really skyrocket, and then they start to drop off again. But then World War II happens, and there's an artificial inflation. There's more money expended, there's more effort expended because now it's not just a business, now it's part of the war effort. And then after the war, over there in 1945, you can see that the sardine harvests just plummeted. The animals simply weren't there anymore. They weren't able to supply it. So from 1916 to the 1950s, here's the pattern. More and more harvesting, a drop with the Great Depression, and a spike with the onset of World War II that continued until the end of the war, after which the number of sardines being harvested dropped precipitously because the populations to support that industry were no longer there during this period. So, what happened? Well, let's go back to our economic model where you're harvesting the fish, you're using energy to produce a product, and also generating some waste. So, what happens if suddenly there are many fewer fish? Suddenly, it's much more difficult. So, what do? Well, one thing you can do is sell less products, sell smaller fish, sell fewer of them. That's one solution you can have. But now it's going to be tougher to make a product, or excuse me, a profit. It's going to be tougher to make a profit off this because people are going to be buying less. There's going to be less available. It will drive up the cost, but it'll also make it more difficult for people to make that purchase. It drives up the cost because of the law of supply and demand. The lower the supply, the higher demand, the higher the cost. The bigger the supply, the lower the demand, the lower the cost. So if you're producing less, then you're going to drive prices up, but people are probably not going to be willing to pay that. So you can charge more money, but that's also not going to help. Another approach would be to expend more energy, to you send more people, to send people further out from shore, to use bigger nets, to hire more people, more boats, and so on. And this is part of what happened in World War II, where because having portable, long lasting, stable food was such an important part of the war effort, there was money contributed to make sure that you had these extra people available to do the harvesting, to do the producing, and so on. And then that plummeted after the end of the war. So you have additional energy being expended so that you can more or less maintain the level of productivity that you've been enjoying prior to then. You can also then charge more money to that to try and fill in the gaps, or you can charge less money and depend on outside sources. Or you can not charge more money, you can cut corners. You can start doing things on the cheap. You can start using a lower quality of aluminum or tin or steel in your casings. You can be less thorough about gutting the fish, less concerned about where the offal goes when you're processing the fish, generating more waste, externalizing more costs so that the consumer is not paying higher prices. And that's what happens with sardines. And even that reaches its limit where after World War II, the populations simply aren't there. The amount of energy you put into it, the number of corners you cut to produce it, are not sufficient to keep up with the dwindling numbers of sardines available for harvesting. And so, after World War II in the 50s and 60s, the sardine industry in Monterey Bay collapsed completely. So, this, for an example, if you were to go up to Monterey Bay and walk along the water today, you would see this is one of those old sardine factories. It's still there, it's been abandoned for decades. I took this picture for you because, again, always thinking of you. But you can still see this there. It's obviously falling apart and rotting because it was back then after the loss of all those sardines when it no longer became profitable to harvest them that the whole industry collapsed. And that meant that all of the people dependent on the fishing industry, the families, the schools, the markets, the gas stations, all of that fell apart as well because they depended on those fish, they depended on the fisher people, and when the fish go away, there's nobody heading out to sea to harvest them. The collapse of the sardine schools led to the collapse of an entire community. Now, this phenomenon has been named, and probably if you've taken biology classes, you may have read the name in some of your uh, textbooks. It's known as the tragedy of the commons, and it was proposed in the 1960s by an individual named Garrett Hardin. And what he said is what we've just described, and we've described it, remember, we've described it with sea otters and with abalone and with gray whales and with sardines, is that you have all these resource bases and you have people over consuming them. And what Garrett Hardin said is that that is inevitable. What he said is any commonly held resource will invariably be degraded or destroyed. If you're all kind of participating in it together, because nobody owned the sardines, right? They're just sardines swimming around in the ocean. Nobody owned the sea otters. Nobody owned the abalone. They were all out there. People harvested them. People sold them. People consumed them. But it was a community held resource. And because everybody was harvesting it, and in many cases were in competition with one another, it was inevitable, according to Garrett Hardin, that that resource would be either damaged or eliminated. I want to emphasize this is what Garrett Hardin said, and this is what I will test you on. That doesn't mean he was right. So don't walk away from this thinking, oh my gosh, this is awful. We're going to talk about that in a moment. I want to let you know in advance that there's more to this story. But when he proposed this, this is what he said. And he said there are only two ways to avoid this. Okay? Think about it. And if we were in person doing this, I would then sit here for like hours waiting for you guys to come up with it. Obviously, this is virtual, so I don't have that option. So let me just give you the answers right now. And yes, obviously, I'm going to be testing you on this. Any commonly held resource will invariably be degraded or destroyed unless you privatize the resource. So imagine the commons, the idea of commons is imagine a big field. And it's a big field of grass, and you have a cow and some sheep and some chickens, and you put them all out in the grass and they run around. Your neighbor has some cows and some sheep and some chickens. They put them out there, and all of your neighbors around this big grassy meadow do the same thing, right? Now, you're raising the chickens, you're raising the sheep, you're raising the cattle in order to sell the meat, sell the milk, sell the leather, sell the eggs, make a profit. You realize as a selfish person, no, let's not make you selfish. Let's make me selfish. I realize that if I have one more cow out there and a couple more chickens out there and a couple more sheep out there, I can sell more meat, more milk, more leather, more eggs than my neighbors and make more of a profit, right? Okay, so I start doing that. And now my neighbors see me doing that and they say, well, that's not fair. So they start doing the same thing. They add a cow, they add a couple more sheep, they add a couple more chickens. And then their neighbors do the same thing. and the neighbors down the way start doing things, and the neighbors across the way start doing it, and suddenly there's a lot more cows and sheep and chickens out there in the commons. And I'm looking at this thinking, well, wait a minute now, it was a great idea, but now I'm back to making the same as everybody else. I will throw another cow out there and another couple of sheep and some more chickens so that I can be making more than my neighbors because I'm a greedy jerk, right? Then the neighbors do the same thing, and it's on and on and on and on until you destroy the resource. Invariably degrade or destroy the resource. One of the ways that Garrett Hardin said you solve that is to privatize the resource. In other words, think of that meadow, think of all the people living around the meadow, and now they fence it off. So now I've got a percentage, a part of that meadow, and I've got fences surrounding it. So everything inside those fences is mine. And I no longer get to participate in what my neighbors are doing. They've got their own yards, their own fields. I've got my field, which means I can put as many cattle and sheep and chickens out there as I want. But if they overconsume the resource, right, I've degraded or destroyed it, but it hasn't affected my neighbors. It's just me. I've avoided the tragedy of the commons because I privatized the resource. If I'm stupid, then I can destroy my own livelihood, but I'm not going to be impacting my neighbors. Does that make sense? According to Garrett Hardin, that is one way to ensure that you avoid the tragedy of the commons. The other is to give coercive power to the government, where you have a government that comes in and says, each of you people around this meadow may only have 2 cows and no more. If we see a third cow out there, we're going to confiscate it. If you see more than 3 chickens out there, we're going to confiscate them, right? You give coercive power to the government to enforce rules on how much can be harvested. This is actually what Ed Ricketts tried to do with the sardines in Pacific Grove, where he asked the government to establish to use its coercive power to establish limits on how much of the resource is being harvested. But because of the way things are, the actual people didn't, the actual fishers didn't listen, and the politicians didn't work too hard to enforce those requirements, those restrictions, and as a consequence, the sardines were lost. So, according to Garrett Hardin, the tragedy of the commons is more or less inevitable unless you privatize the resource and you give coercive power to the government. And I emphasize this because, again, and getting back to the beginning of the term, the beginning of the semester, I told you there's not going to be a textbook. This is part of the reason why, because textbooks today still talk about the tragedy of the commons and they don't give you the other side of the issue because Garrett Hardin actually wasn't, he was advancing this as a biological principle, a biological certainty, but what he was actually doing was trying to restrict immigration into the United States because he was very much a believer in eugenics, which, as we have discussed, is a pseudoscience. It's not real. But he still, even in the 1960s, saw that only certain, in his view, this is not correct. Okay, don't think I'm saying this, but this is what he was thinking, is that only certain people should be allowed to reproduce, and others not only shouldn't necessarily be allowed to reproduce, they shouldn't even be allowed into the country because if they're in the country, they're going to take advantage of quote unquote our resources and degrade and destroy those resources. Okay, so it was presented as if it was a biological argument, a biological theory, but it had very definite, very strong, and pseudo-scientific underpinnings, so that it wasn't actually good biological science, which is why it's so frustrating to read about this in biology textbooks today. And I'm not saying that you can't overharvest a resource. You absolutely can. That's why we talked about renewable resources becoming non-renewable resources. And what we see in the Monterey Bay area is exactly that, over and over and over, is people depleting the resource faster than it can be replenished. And as a consequence, renewable resources become non-renewable resources. And then the economies that depend on those resources fall apart when the resources are no longer there. So it can happen, but it doesn't mean that it's a biological inevitability. And this has been demonstrated. Number one, You've probably been taught this your whole life. How many of you have been taught, here's something now, but you should put some of this away for later? How many of you are doing that right now with your paycheck? And I understand that many of you aren't making as much money as you would like. I'm not making as much money as I would like. That's why I'm working part time, um, over and above my day job. And I don't want to go down that road. I simply want to say that if you can, you're trying to set some money by. You're also setting your time by. You're probably going to school because you think that there is going to be a payoff down the road. It's going to make you more marketable. It's going to get you a better job. And so you were taking the time now, investing the time now, hoping for a payoff later. And that's pretty standard thinking for just about everybody. And you've been knowing this since you were a kid, where you can maybe have some cookies now, but you can also set some aside later in the cookie jar that you can come back to. So mom makes them once, you're using some of them now, you're eating some of them later. It's just called willpower. It's not inevitable that you have to consume all of the cookies at once. It's not an inevitability. I'm about to show you a picture of my wife's nephew and niece that I think captures this perfectly. This is from many years ago when they were very young. They're now all grown up and smarter than I am. Um, but obviously, the one on the left knows that she's supposed to hold that donut for that picture, and she's patiently waiting for the picture to be taken before she dives in. And the young gentleman on the right is having none of that. He's going to eat his right now. It's the way we respond to things, but it's being aware of that response and knowing about that response that guides our actions. And it's knowing that it is not inevitable that we will absolutely always degrade or destroy a resource. And it's very basic, but this was presented as if it was a biological fact. The other side of that is that in 1990, Eleanor Ostrom published on how there are peoples who have managed to avoid that. They have not privatized the resource and they have not given coercive power to the government, and yet their resource is not invariably degraded or destroyed. It's maintained. She even won the Nobel Prize for her research, which completely rejects what Garrett Hardin was saying. Again, not saying that resources can't be depleted, but definitely arguing that it is not inevitable and that Garrett Hardin's two proposed solutions for it are not the only game in town. And so we've even had examples of that tonight in this lecture when I mentioned the Ohlone. And we talked about how for thousands of years they were harvesting grasses, they were harvesting seeds, they were harvesting acorns, they were harvesting fish, they were harvesting sea otters. And they were doing it without, quote unquote, invariably degrading or destroying the resource. They harvested what they needed and they did not invariably degrade the resource. And while the Ohlone, and again, I will emphasize, I'm focused on them because of the geography and because of that PNAS study, but the same thing is true for other California indigenous groups and indigenous groups throughout North America, where the same thing is happening. They are working within the confines of their environment. They aren't over harvesting it, they aren't degrading it, they aren't destroying it. They are altering it because they are large mammals. They are consuming food to get energy, and as we talked about, the given the background of humans as primary consumers moving into a secondary, tertiary, and so on consumer level, you're going to have an impact. But that doesn't mean you are invariably going to destroy the resource. As another example from historic times, if you want to get outside of California, there were the Plains Indians. And it's the same thing, except in this case, instead of fish, they were harvesting bison. But there were 30 million bison roaming North America at that time. And so it appeared to be a never ending resource. Now, as we're going to see in a future lecture, later European explorers pretty much reduced bison almost to extinction. And it's only through assigning governmental control that bison were preserved and are still with us today. But that was because of a different approach. That was a different way of thinking. In terms of these communities, they had an effective system that was working year in and year out, decade in and decade out for thousands of years. And so It is not inevitable that the resource is degraded, but that doesn't mean it can't be if you aren't being careful. And it gets back to our discussion of, are you part of a community, or are you looking at this as a commodity, something to make a profit from? Now, in terms of the Monterey Bay area, eventually everything fell apart, everything collapsed and went away. And then in the 1980s, one of those old fisheries was resurrected as what is today the Monterey Bay Aquarium, which, by the way, I so strongly encourage you to visit. It is possibly the world class marine aquarium on the planet. And it's extremely important to us because its specific focus is the California kelp forest. And so you can learn about the California kelp forest here, which is increasingly healthy. If you go to the aquarium, you will see sea otters because they have returned to these ecosystems. And then if you go out into Monterey Bay, you will see sea otters out there as well. Once the people stopped treating this area the way they were treating it, going through one resource after another, things had a chance to breathe, things had a chance to relax, and the sea otters had been locally extirpated, locally eliminated, but they were still in some parts of California. And once the hunting pressure eased up, suddenly they were able to make a comeback. And so now you yourself could go to this area and other areas along the California coast and take pictures of otters if you are so inclined. They actually are pretty darn adorable, and very fuzzy. Over 600,000 hairs per square inch. That's an awful lot of adorable fuzz. So keep that in mind. Now, that means that as they return, they start preying on the sea urchins, and so they reduce the numbers of the sea urchins, and so the kelp forests are able to come back. And in many areas in California, the kelp forests are increasingly healthy because of the return of the sea otters. However, that's not true everywhere. It is increasingly true in the Monterey Bay area, but if you head up to northern parts of California, you still have a greatly reduced kelp canopy, and it's not just because of sea otters, it's because of other organisms that ate sea urchins, specifically sea stars, which are also secondary consumers, and they will eat other meat animals. They will eat primary consumers. And there is a disease that is prevalent among these animals, sea star wasting disease, I believe it's called. And as their numbers dwindle, the numbers of sea urchins goes up. And if the number of sea urchins goes up, then the amount of kelp goes down. And so that's what's happening in Northern California today. And you can see here, this is an article from 2021 talking about how kelp forests off the coast of Northern California have declined by 95%. Kelp has been replaced, you can read it there, by widespread urchin barrens that may persist long into the future, as we just talked about. Sea otters will eat those sea stars, and so even though they're there, it's a meat source that they will take advantage of as well, which, by the way, would make them, think about it. If sea stars are eating urchins, that means that they are secondary consumers because the urchins are eating plants, so they're primary consumers. So if a sea otter is eating a sea star, that means it's a tertiary consumer. Don't know if I'll test you on that or not, but if I do, it would be cool. And I would be very pleased if you got it right because it means you would be thinking clearly. Anyway, this is an article that came out early in 2021, and I want to bring this up because it talks about the importance of sea otters. And I should mention that sea otters in this context, and I touched on this very briefly in an earlier lecture, the impact that sea otters are having on their ecosystems is so strong. And here's another thing I might test you on, because sea otters are keystone species in their ecosystems. And if you eliminate them, then the ecosystem undergoes a dramatic change, as we've been seeing. So that makes them, if I ask you true or false, sea otters are a keystone species, the answer is true. In any event, this is talking about how the return of sea otters is promoting the health of kelp forests, even in areas where you have the sea star wasting disease. And this is a diagram. I'm going to show it, sea star wasting syndrome. Sorry, that's what it's called. I won't test you on that. But look at this diagram. Let me walk you through it. Here you have sea star wasting syndrome is eliminating the sea stars, urchin predators, right? as we talked about, secondary consumers, which means the sea urchins, their numbers explode. They're doing because you removed a predator. Okay. Now, actively foraging urchins in barrens are starving, whereas passive foraging urchins in kelp forests remain healthy. And it's because of the sea otters. The sea otters are eating the healthy urchins. Okay, and that enhances the ability of the kelp forest in those areas. The urchins there are being reduced. So in kelp forests, you have healthy urchins, and that's attractive to the sea otters, and so they eat them, and it helps maintain the kelp forests. In the urchin barrens, because there's so little food, because the urchins have overshot the carrying capacity of their environment, you have unhealthy or at least less healthy urchins that are less attractive to the sea otters. And so over in the kelp forest, you have a healthy ecosystem. In the urchin barrens, not so much. And the two are distinguishing between each other. And so that's what's going on with sea otters along the coast of California today. And even in other areas, here's a paper from January of 2024 that talks about the Elkhorn Slough area in California, where with increasing sea otter abundance, you had healthier marine and coastal ecosystems. For the same reason, they are contributing to that environment because they are a keystone species. However, a caveat, I won't test you on this. This is an article from earlier this year, March of 2025, because I'm keeping up to date on this stuff for you, because I'm looking out for you. I'm always looking out for you. And this is talking about a 30-year study, both here in California on San Nicolas Island and up near Vancouver Island in Canada. And in both cases, the reintroduction of sea otters helped the local communities, but that help was faster in Vancouver. It was a much more direct relationship between the sea otters and the urchins and the kelp, whereas here in California, there's different temperatures, different communities, different biomes, and as a consequence, the otters are having an impact, but it's not so dramatic as what you're seeing up north. And so, biologically, you see the importance of keystone species. Economically, you see the importance of um, resource use, resource management, and being aware that you can deplete things unnecessarily. And so the importance of sea otters to the kelp forest ecosystem is a biological fact. The importance of otters to economic regimes, human driven economic regimes, is also important. And it demonstrates what happens when you have a resource, be it otters, be it abalone, be it sardines, that then is overconsumed, overharvested. When that goes away, it can have dramatic economic impacts, negative economic impacts. And we will come back to this in a future lecture where instead of talking about marine organisms in a restricted geographic area, we talk about other non renewable resources and what happens when those are being overharvested. But that's a different lecture. That's in the future. And that's the end of tonight's lecture. So, as always, if you have questions, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to do my best to try to answer them. I hope you enjoyed all the cute otter pictures. There will be otter questions on the upcoming exam, which again will be 1 week from today. All right. I will send out a study guide next week. I'll send out more information next week, and we'll take our second midterm. We're almost halfway through the term. It's really moving fast, at least for me. I can't speak for you. In any event, you all have a good evening. You take care of yourselves. Hope you have a good weekend ahead, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care. Stay safe.